I feel like this is something that bizarrely, we work in horror, we are Christians, and we think about it a lot, but it's also not really a question we think about a lot as well. I know that sounds kind of mad, but for us it's such an intuitive, instinctive thing to be working in horror, and to be making horror films and watching horror films. So actually when someone says, oh, why do you work in horror? How do you reconcile that with your Christian faith? What's the link? A part of me is like, well, it's obvious, but then it's actually quite hard sometimes to put it into words. So I feel like the point of this discussion is to try and tease out what are some of the motivations, some of the thinking, some of the reasons why we're compelled by horror, and what we think its place is in the world for Christians, and also just the secular world at large.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, that when you were saying then that we don't really think about working in horror or being Christians working in horror, it doesn't really come up. So at some level, we've never seen it as a conflict or an issue that necessarily needs to be addressed. I mean, I know that there's some Christian families around, that we know of locally, people who don't, for example, celebrate Halloween or make anything of Halloween. But I remember, our dad making a big thing at Halloween and be like kind of stringing up, spiders and cobwebs and putting little, jelly bats around the house and changing the lighting. And it was all a bit of fun. And I asked, our dad once about that, and I said, is it okay that we celebrate Halloween? And he said something to me about, I don't feel the devil is really, in these, these chocolate bats. I think that evil operates in a much more subtle way. And he explained to me the concept of the angel of light and how real evil seeps into a culture through what seems attractive or like a good idea or something that's beautiful or seductive, and that's how people really, get into a dark place. It often doesn't come in an obviously horrific way. So, that was a discussion I had with him when I was young, and you probably had a similar discussion with him. So, right from the beginning, it never seemed like we had to apologise about things like Halloween.
No, I don't think we were raised in that kind of a family that took issue with Halloween and was able to separate out some of the imagery and symbolism, of the macabre and death and the uncanny, from how evil really operates in the world. Now, obviously, to play devil's advocate to that, there is a belief in kind of New Age circles or occult circles that around Halloween, the veil between heaven, hell, and earth becomes thin, and there's an increased activity of spiritual beings and entities operating. Whether that's true or not, or whether that's just people attributing those things to that time of the year and getting involved in the occult more at that time of year, I don't know. But for me, I think there's a big difference between somebody going out and having a bit of spooky cosplay, fancy dress with friends and celebrating the creativity of their costumes, celebrating the pop icons in horror movies or comics or whatever it is, literature, art. There's a big difference between that, where your primary desire is to be entertained, have fun, to talk about spooky things, maybe even open up conversations about the afterlife and death and what happens and so on. Big difference between that and actually sitting down with, let's say, a Ouija board or with crystals or something and trying to bend the will of spirits and evil entities to your will to achieve some kind of idolatrous or selfish gain. And so a lot of people lump that together and say, oh, Halloween is just all kind of evil and occult, and it's a celebration or a glorification of things that are not of God, and that we should be, focusing on noble things, whatever is lovely, whatever is pure, that we see in the Bible is referenced. But actually, I think we need to tease those things apart, because Halloween can mean very different things for people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there's that phrase, isn't it? The best view of heaven is from hell. So I think if you remove the darkness from your understanding or from your comprehension, you don't necessarily see the light. And I think that things that are dark can often be a way to come to understand what the light is, and how, you know, the light overcomes the darkness. And I think that horror films can be an important part of that understanding, to see how that works. And in a sense, I think Christians are well placed to be having those discussions, but also creating art that speaks into that reality, because we do live in a horrifying reality. I mean, it's God's universe and it's God's world, and it's filled with beauty, but it's also broken, and it's riddled with chaos, and evil is at work, both in the heart of man and you know, with spiritual forces that are battling it out behind the scenes. And I think Christians can create a meaningful context in which those forces can battle themselves out. And for example, one of the first films I watched as a kid was, you know, when I was kind of getting towards, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something like that. I think I watched Return of the Jedi. And that was the first time that I remember really kind of seeing the battle between good and evil contextualized in a symbolic way that had meaning for me. So it was like, whose side are you on? Is it Darth Vader, you know, with the red lightsaber, or is it Luke Skywalker, you know, who's got the green one? And these massive forces, you know, with their powers, you know, being Jedis and all that, was just a kind of way of understanding, as an unformed mind, what the battle might look like between good and evil. And of course, you know, that's the great thing about storytelling. That's the great thing about filmmaking, is that it can become, you know, symbolic of those forces at play. It can create a kind of morality tale where you can live through the hero who overcomes the darkness, who overcomes what's set against you, and that can give you encouragement for your own journey. But of course, the true horror in life often comes not in a way, you know, where you've got the emperor turning up, you know, with an old crusty face in a hood, or like some of the villains in Doctor Who, you know, like the Master and those kind of, you know, grotesque creatures coming out of the dark. But the real horror often comes with a, you know, a bill that you can't afford to pay, or a child who gets sick, or somebody in your family who's going through something really terrible. And that can be much more complex to know how to deal with. So for me, horror's mostly a world of kind of fun and an escape from some of the real darkness that is out there. But that's not to say there aren't really horrifying films that actually are dark, and I think there are. But a lot of the, you know, the kind of films we're talking about, and Halloween, tends to be more on that fun side. But it's a wide and complex genre, and of course there are films that are horror movies that are very disturbing, and there are some horror movies perhaps that aren't good to watch at all and are just nihilistic and sadistic.
Do you think that you know, all Christians should be at least considering watching horror movies? You know, is it a genre that should be written off because it's unhelpful or it glorifies evil? What are some of the arguments or the benefits for Christians in watching a horror movie?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all Christians should watch horror movies. I think that's like saying all people should try hot curry. It's not for everybody, but for those who enjoy that, you know, it can be an exhilarating experience. I mean, eating hot curry can release endorphins. I love that, for example, and it kind of wakes me up, and I can really taste the food, which is the opposite of what a lot of people think, is you eat hot food and you can't taste anything. But I have the opposite you know, impact when I eat hot curry. But the same thing with horror movies is that I find myself feel very alive when I'm watching a horror film, and if the adrenaline's going and you're on the edge, and you know, you feel anxious, but you're still in a safe context because you still know that you're kind of safe at home. You're not truly in danger, but temporarily you've put yourself psychologically into the hands of the filmmaker to go through this journey. I think it can be a very exhilarating experience, but it's not for everybody, and not everybody should feel the need to open themselves to that genre. The other thing as well is it is a very wide genre. And so within that, we could be talking about the most violent and despicable films to, things that are just very gentle and fun and entertaining. You could go from Casper the Friendly Ghost to Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Terrifier 3 or to even darker films underground. And I think discernment's important. But I think that there's no simplistic answer of just saying, oh, horror movies glorify Satan, all Christians should stay away from that.
Yeah, because I think if you are going to take that line, then you essentially need to reject most art that's ever been created, all genres of movies, because all genres glorify evil to a certain extent, some less than others, some more than others. Romantic comedies, we know, is a great conduit for very ungodly values and deeply evil worldviews about relationships and about sex, and yet we sit there and we're entertained and we laugh and we cry and we start to empathise with people who are in dilemmas and deliberately, willfully choose decisions which a biblical worldview would really challenge. So we can't do that with art. I think that posture of condemnation towards art in general is not a good posture for Christians to take. And I know that's a tempting thing because it's easy and it doesn't require any wisdom or discernment. And if you live in a way that doesn't require any wisdom or discernment, you'll have a very easy life because you just reject everything and you narrow your world down and you consume less and less of the world's content and art and culture, and you create your own kind of slightly odd Christian subculture. But you also remove yourself from the ability to engage meaningfully with society, with people who don't share your worldview, and to join the conversation and actually have any kind of spiritual impact on anybody. And you become more like some kind of odd-looking cult, I think. So I think our posture should be one of engagement and also creativity. We know that God is a creator God, and he has put us on a track of mirroring that creativity in him. And so if you have a gift to be able to create wonderful paintings or literature or movies or whatever it is, and you're drawn towards the macabre and the dark things of life, then I really believe that you should be following that calling as a Christian, because Christians of all people, in theory, should know what horror is really about. They should know what is horrifying in life, and they should know how demons operate. They should know how evil operates, because the answers are all there in the Bible. And we also know how it's all going to end up ultimately. So we know how to set horror within a context of redemption. And that's why the Bible never shies away from talking about evil and suffering, because it's always within a larger framework of redemption. So you've got this incredible picture of darkness, that is woven through the Bible, but the light is so much stronger. And John talks about that. The darkness has been overwhelmed by the light has not been overwhelmed by the darkness. So Christians are always operating from within that, which gives us I think a safety to be able to create works which are profoundly disturbing and unsettling, because let's be honest, a lot of us need waking up. We need a really big jolt, and I believe horror movies are one of the best ways in terms of art to be able to give people a jolt and to unsettle them and make them really fear God in a different kind of way.
I mean, in terms of this waking up, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, there's a line in Candyman, and I don't think I can get it word perfect, but it's something where Candyman says in the film with his voice, and he's the kind of vengeful spirit of a black man who's killed horrifically in a racist attack, an innocent man who comes back to sort of terrorise a community that originally oppressed him. But anyway, in that film, there's a line where Candyman says, and he's speaking from beyond the grave as a spirit, what can the good know other than what the evil can teach them by their excesses? And it's almost like when you look at what's dark and evil and terrifying, but you're still anchored in God, but you look into it. So if you look at what the Nazis did, what they really did, and that's not for everybody to do that, it might be in a different way, just might be looking at crimes that are going on or injustice or something like that, then it does help to illuminate why as Christians, we cling to a God of justice and righteousness and what it looks like to be forgiven when you look at the horrors of what human beings can do and what they can become. So there can be something quite cleansing about experiencing darkness or at least looking into it in the right way. But like everything, if it's not done from a position of being anchored in what's good, you can lose yourself to it. And if all you did was, fed yourself on horror movies day in, day out and didn't do much else, it would be very harmful for you. So, a bit like, back to the curry analogy, if all I had was hot curry, I probably wouldn't be very well very quickly. But if every now and then I have a nice hot curry, I can really enjoy that. It's the same with horror films. I think if all you do is consume horror movies, that could become a problem. Because sooner or later you'd also watch films that aren't very good, because it's a mixed genre, Yeah. You've got films that do have a profound sense of good overcoming evil. I mean, The Exorcist is one of them. When The Exorcist first came out, the original one, a lot of people flocked to the nearest church because they thought, goodness me, the spiritual battle's real. I better align myself up with God if it's real. Or if there is a devil, then there must be a God.
It's interesting on that subject of horror films ending with some sense of, good reigning over evil. I've wondered about this because obviously as Christians we know that God reigns supreme over evil. It's not even a close contest. So there's always a cause for joy and peace and life, in the context of something horrifying happening. But I often find that the horror movies that I'm most impacted by quite often are ones that are very bleak and end without a sense of resolution or a sense of justice, and often end with a sense of real dark nihilism or a sense of evil reigning. I think of films like Hereditary, even a film like Long Legs has a sense of this kind of uncontrollable satanic power in the world, and even Rosemary's Baby. God is dead. At the end of that decade, at the end of the 60s, that was a big movement, and I think it was on Time magazine, wasn't it? That sense of God is dead, and the film was reflecting this idea of Satan, this hailing Satan and saying God is dead, speaking in society at that moment. There's not really a sense of goodness reigning. But what's interesting is about those films, for me at least, they actually make me come away from those films and think, my goodness, I'm so glad I don't live in that world that I've seen. I've got a God to go to, and I've got a God that can defeat all of that. I suppose it's because I have that knowledge, that training, if you like, that insight from God. It means I can approach those films, and it unsettles me to such a degree that you appreciate God more. Like you say, that the view of heaven suddenly becomes a lot clearer when you're dwelling in hell.
And you don't always get that resolution, and I think to always want that resolution in every film, I think that was maybe a more simplistic answer I gave. I think that sometimes the uplift comes because that story, is one of good overcoming evil. But there are horror films that don't give you that resolution, but they can still be profoundly important. I think ultimately, in faith, we all know that there's a good ending to this story of life, but we have to live for a long time in a sense of not entirely seeing the fullness of what that victory means. And therefore, these films, that don't necessarily give you the happy ending, the typical Hollywood ending, serve their purpose. They can still be cathartic, and maybe some of these films express the deepest sense of despair we might have about something, that nobody's coming immediately to rescue me, or maybe it will have to get much worse before it ever gets better. And sometimes you don't get saved by the knight in shining armor or the hero, and for a time darkness wins and rules over. There are other films that aren't strictly horror, but I think have horror elements, like, for example, Melancholia, Lars von Trier's film, and I find his work very interesting. Some of his films I really don't like, can't stand, find too nihilistic, and others I find very profoundly interesting. But I think Melancholia gives a tremendous picture. It's a very bleak film. It depicts what it's like to have depression in no film I've ever seen before. That and Antichrist, but I think particularly Melancholia, with the images of Kirsten Dunst moving through the swamp in the wedding dress, and she's kind of being held back by these kind of smoky black weeds or something that are kind of grabbing her, and she's like, everything's in slow motion. For me, that's an incredible depiction of what it's like to live with a profound, depression, a physical depression where it's just incredibly hard to get up the stairs. That's something I've experienced a lot of my life, and I was really happy when Lars von Trier depicted that in a film, because I thought, oh well, that resonates with me. Like, someone understands what that can feel like. Whereas other people, and I imagine quite a lot of Christians, say, I'd never watch a film by Lars von Trier if they know anything about him. He's twisted, he's strange, his films are dark, they're sexually dark and violent and all the rest. And yeah, that might all be true, but his films are also poetic and in many ways a work of genius, a lot of his films. Like David Lynch films as well. The characters in David Lynch films can be so dark and twisted, but they can also be set against characters that have this angelic sweetness to them, or this complete innocence. It's like Twin Peaks, you've got the evil spirit of Bob, who possesses people in this small town, who's just out for, murder and chaos and violence. And then you've got Agent Coop, who's the FBI agent, who comes in to, try and figure out who killed the local prom queen, Laura Palmer, who's like the Christ-like figure, who's got integrity, who's honourable, who, wants to bring truth into that place and to set people free from this darkness. And, it takes people of a certain mind to bring these stories to life. And I think if you were to only live in a very happy, sheltered environment, you wouldn't be able to probably tell those kind of stories. You need to know about the darkness, whether for your own personal life or through studying the work of others. And there was a story by David Lynch that he grew up in a very innocent town. His dad was a logger, and everybody was having picnics and smiling. Post-war baby boom, 1950s. And then he walked into a subway with a relative to go into somewhere like Pennsylvania in the States. And he experienced like this ocean of fear hitting him like a train. And he just felt like electricity went through him. And there was this feeling of he'd not encountered this darkness or picked it up before, but he was feeling it. And that influenced a lot of his films, where you've got these layers of beauty and innocence and safety, but beneath the ground, like in Blue Velvet at the beginning, with the pictures of the grass and the firemen waving and this lovely quiet little town, but beneath that are these beetles fighting it out beneath the lawn. And that's what Blue Velvet is about in many ways, is scratch beneath the surface and things aren't right. But as a Christian, we can be brave enough to go, okay, now scratch beyond the surface, things aren't right, and the darkness gets really dark, much worse than you can possibly imagine. But ultimately, it's in the context of hope. And the light is much greater than the darkness, ultimately. So we don't need to be afraid when darkness comes our way. So there's all these textures and layers to movies and to art. And I think the best art isn't afraid to look into the darkness or to use the darkness as part of the material by which the work is created.
Yeah, and I think that it's important for Christians to engage well with horror, whether that's understanding it, watching it, appreciating it, using it in their discourse in the world, or whether it's creating it. Because when you look around at people who enjoy horror films, people who aren't Christians, wouldn't consider themselves spiritual necessarily, or maybe they do. Think about this. What is it they're seeking? What is it they get from horror films? You talked earlier about the experience of feeling more alive, like a hot curry, that it kind of causes a surge through your body. You feel more in touch with your senses and so on. Any horror fan will know that. There's a deep connection between anyone who appreciates horror. When you learn at a party that someone likes horror, you immediately strike up a conversation, you share that. It's a great buzz. But what is it those people are actually seeking? What do they experience when they are watching a horror film or reading a horror story or so on? And I think there's a theologian called Rudolf Otto, a German theologian who some time ago came up with this idea of the numinous, and the numinous describes a spiritual encounter which is two things. It's one, it's awesome and alluring and attractive to the most infinite degree, like encountering something so amazing and powerful that you're drawn into it, captivated by it. But at the same time, it's also incredibly frightening, terrifying, trembling, fear-inducing as well. So the two aspects to the numinous experience. And he says that this is actually part of how we encounter God. To understand what that encounter with God is like, we need to understand both those aspects. And you see it in the Gospels and in the Old Testament when angels appear and kind of God manifests in some way. People are afraid. People are at once kind of compelled and forced to kind of bow down or whatever, submit themselves, but they're also afraid, and God has to reassure people and say, don't be afraid. And he can kind of reveal, the kindness behind that. But there's a force at work which people are compelled by and changed by. Now, I think that there's something like that going on when people watch horror movies, that they want to be captivated by something, to see some power, some force that's so far beyond them, something so intriguing and alluring. At the same time, they want it to be frightening and terrifying and beyond themselves, so they feel out of control. And for some inexplicable reason, people enjoy that experience, or at least some people enjoy that experience. And I wonder if it's because deep inside all of us, there is a sense of that is the closest we can get to encountering God. So when we sit down to watch horror films, there's a part of us that is actually seeking to emulate an experience of encountering God. Now, for a Christian, we can have both, and one shapes the other. So we encounter God in our daily walk, or through a powerful conversion experience for some. And then when we watch a horror film, we're recapturing that moment. And I think for me, watching a horror film, I want to see evil manifested, and I want to see how that sin or that evil situation is resolved, and where the good sense comes in and overcomes that, because it plays out that experience of encountering God and the gospel working out salvation in my own life. But for the people who don't know God, I guess they're trying to conjure an experience they haven't necessarily had yet, but they secretly, subconsciously desire.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting way of talking about it. I mean, curiosity, has its own reason for existing, and it's a mystery why. Does this go back to the fall that we all desire the knowledge of good and evil? So it's the knowledge of good and evil. Why are people so interested in crime stories? It's one of the most popular genres, for either fiction or even, non-fiction. If you look at Netflix, for example, a huge section of crime films and real life crime stories, and people are interested in why people do things, or looking into those darker things, and that's it. There is a mystery to why we're drawn to that, and it could be, like you say, reaching out for an experience of the other, something that is outside of the mundane, to see what's at the bottom of the garden fence, the child who always wants to get beyond the garden fence, and that, is that an evolutionary principle that we live under, part of the reason human beings are always striving to understand and go further and explore further, something that's inbuilt into us. And horror gives a context in which we can explore disturbing and frightening things without having to have the guilt of participating in them directly. There is a paradox to horror. I mean, why is it on screen? If somebody opens a hospital waste bin, it's like repulsive and, kind of, what they're going to do next. That's shocking. But in real life, no one would go and do that in a hospital for fun. Obviously, in the context of a story and what's going on the screen, it becomes something quite different. Why we're drawn to, what's hideous and grotesque and disturbing and worrying. But I do think a lot of it comes back to that, waking us up to, when you experience the darkness, it can wake you up a lot to the light. And I think a lot about, the crucifixion of Jesus had to be really bad in order for the power of that, he had to be completely dead. And I mean, RoboCop, completely dead. I mean, he's either dead or not, but you know what I mean? He had to be brutalised beyond belief. And the same thing, like with RoboCop, for example, is a, dark resurrection story. And Paul Verhoeven spoke about, he wanted it to be like The Passion, that, the devil really goes for Jesus on the cross. But, when Murphy's shot to bits in RoboCop, he's like, he's just brutalised beyond belief. It's so dark. But when he resurrects in the shiny knight, knight in shining armour as RoboCop, or rebuilt, it is like Jesus, resurrecting. And now he's more powerful than you can possibly imagine, and unstoppable. And when he gets the bad guys, wow, you're so happy he's got those bad guys, because they were so evil. They were horrible. They blew his hand off. Yeah. Who does that? And I think that does go back to, you need a really dark night sky to see the stars. And that's mysterious how that's at work. But the resurrection theme is so powerful in a lot of contemporary cinema. I mean, like the Bourne films, the first one, he's just waking up adrift at sea, can't remember what's happened to him. So how is he still alive? And then he gradually comes to realise who he is and how powerful he is. But it's a resurrection story. And the whole way through all those films, he's figuring out who he really is. Which is a lot of what our story is about as Christians, is through all the darkness and things we go through, finally what it's about, it's all about coming to realise who we really are in Christ, to know that, Christ has forgiven us, that we are God's prized possession. And hopefully, as we come more and more into that identity, we become more powerful, more able to, channel God's love and power into this world that desperately needs it. I mean, it's really interesting. I think once you start noticing these things, I mean, having a discussion's great, what a great thing to talk about, but once you start noticing these themes and these, you'll start seeing it in lots of films, not only in horror, but in other genre as well. I mean, Terminator, there's a resurrection element to Terminator. In the second Terminator film, when, he's the good Terminator, is protecting John Connor from the bad one, and you think it's all over when he gets smashed to bits and a metal pole gets through his back, and then he flicks the alternative power switch, pulls the metal pole out of his back, and I remember seeing that as a kid as well and thinking, the resurrection of Jesus. This is like goodness overcoming darkness, and the worst moment possible, when it's all over, he gets back up. Same with Rocky, all these great 80s movies. And I do think this is a way that, God speaks to humanity through film. And, we're kind of filmmakers working in, independent film, very small budget kind of work at the moment and the rest of it. But it's amazing that we can be in a place where we can be part of that and learn to use that language, and you learn how to use that language for good. But at the same time, not every story you're going to tell is always going to be a happy one. It's not always going to end well. Sometimes there are stories to be told where it doesn't end well.
In terms of Christians then working in artistic professions, whether it's film or writing or painting, music, is there a kind of apologetic for horror, or a kind of approach to horror they should have, as opposed to somebody who's completely secular, atheistic, or from some other religion? Is there, like, for example, the idea of redemptive horror? Should Christians be making redemptive horror? There's always a sense of clear redemption. How much does it need to point towards the literal gospel story of salvation through Jesus Christ? Or actually, is it more nuanced than that, that Christians should be making art, at a very intuitive level, not thinking too analytically or too literally about how to connect their work with the gospel or the Bible in some way?
Yeah, I think it should be the former, really, to be honest. That if it's more of a literal retelling of, I don't know, whatever you think is the good story that should be told, it won't come across as authentic. So I think that, you know, being able to allow each story to speak in an authentic way to you as a creative, as an artist, as a filmmaker, and just tell that story honestly is more important than just trying to kind of squeeze it into a gospel hope story. I mean, that's like kind of Christian bookshop art, which, you know, is great for a certain subgroup of Christians, but it doesn't reach the mass audience. And I think that, you know, when films are told, you know, authentically, but the person behind it has a faith or a Christian worldview, naturally that will come out in the retelling of that story.